In a casual conversation with a young female friend, with a certain ominous tone in her voice, she asked me, "Have you been following the Gabby Petito story?" The honest answer was, I have been trying not to follow the case of this missing, rather angelic looking 22-year-old, the blonde, blue eyed, petite young woman who was smiling out at the world through nearly constant news coverage for several days. My friend asked me about it in a very sincere way, though, and I could see she was visibly shaken. She is a petite, blonde, blue-eyed young single mom making her own way through the world and living in an apartment complex where she's sometimes scared of the kind of sketchy people there. And she has had boyfriends over the years who had some rather frighteningly bad habits. And so it's easy for her to be frightened by a story like this. I realized that her fear was real, but it was also being constantly stoked by excessive coverage of this single woman's disappearance and murder, apparently at the hands of a bad boyfriend. The case of Gabby Petito is horrifying. Her story is sad and heart-wrenching. It's a cautionary tale to vulnerable women everywhere. But then the cases of Elizabeth Smart, JonBenet Ramsey, Laci Peterson, Natalie Holloway, they were all horrifying. In this country of 350 million people, more than 250,000 women go missing every year. 250,000 women, more than 20,000 a month. Most of them are younger than 21. Of course, as many, if not more, men go missing every year. Some are abducted, some are murdered, but they're all people. They're all people, arguably people who are just as important as Laci Peterson, JonBenet Ramsey, Natalie Holloway, Elizabeth Smart, or Gabby Petito. And I don't want to take anything away from the trauma and grief experienced by the families in each of these cases. But when journalists who are women of color start to complain about the missing white woman syndrome, we all need to acknowledge that the media simply does not treat missing people of color the same way that they treat white women. In Wyoming, where Petito's body was found, there have been at least 710 indigenous women who have vanished in the last 10 years. According to a report by Wyoming's Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons Task Force, Native American women are abducted at a rate 10 times as high as white women, and yet we almost never hear about it, and no one knows any of their names. Not one. My daughter is of Korean birth, and thankfully race has not played a big part in her life. She came to the United States when she was only 4 months old, so she speaks English without a foreign accent, and she has turned into a remarkably beautiful woman. So in almost every setting, her race has not been an issue. It has occasionally come up, but for her, most of the time, being a brown person is not so threatening. However, I know as I stand here today that there are between 50 and 100 Korean women who have been trafficked into the sex trade who are right now, right here in Springfield, Missouri. A network of massage parlors and brothels circulate tens of thousands of Korean women around the country, keeping them from ever learning English or forming lasting friendships. They are constantly being moved around. These women don't even show up in our numbers of abducted or missing women because they have been trafficked from a foreign country. The police know where they are, and they almost never do anything about it. I've lived in this city for 30 years, and some of the same brothels have been open with their signs out front advertising their Oriental spa all the time I've been here. However, we all know if that brothel was populated by young white women who spoke English who had been abducted from the United States, the police would be there closing these sex shops down before nightfall today. The whole point of the Black Lives Matter movement has not been to say that Black lives matter more than other lives, more than white lives or Native American lives or Latina lives, because there's never been a time in America where anyone ever wondered if white lives mattered. That's been obvious. The emphatic statement that Black Lives Matter is asserting is that Black people are also people, that their lives matter just as much, but you couldn't tell it by the coverage they receive in the media. Now, I don't want this to become a hair on fire message today. I understand the news media has a very real obligation to inform the public about what's going on. And the cases of each of these white women I've mentioned, they were newsworthy. But I also recognize that our news agencies are all in a capitalist competition with one another. So when they are having to consider from among the 10,000 women that have gone missing this month, which one are they going to report? Which one are they going to follow up on and give updates and repeat day after day? They pick the ones that the public is the most interested in knowing about. And in that sense, the media itself becomes like a snake that is eating its own tail. The media creates concern about beautiful young white women through repetition of stories about beautiful young white women. And then they become obligated to report on the next missing beautiful young white woman. I moved here in 1991. At that time, the demographics of Springfield, Missouri was almost a racial plenum. 1% Black, 2% Asian, 97% white, not enough Hispanic people to even mention. My daughter was only 2 years old at the time, and I was determined to make being Korean totally normal in my house. So I ordered Korean garments, Korean coloring books, music, videos, and toys because I didn't want for her to grow up believing that blonde Barbies are the image of what a normal woman looks like. In her young mind, I needed for her to see that if there is anyone who is deformed and abnormal, it is the traditional blonde Barbie. However, at that time, parents of young children shopped at Toys R Us for Christmas and birthday presents. And while we had a lot of white dolls to choose from, and even several black dolls in Springfield at that time, even though Asians outnumbered blacks 2-1, there was not a single Asian-looking doll. That was the second largest minority population in town, but they were not a part of the consciousness of the people who ordered dolls to stock the shelves. I demanded to see the manager because that's how I am. And I pointed out to the manager, all these dolls were made in Asia. Would it hurt you to have one that looked like an Asian? Thankfully, though, he agreed, and he made sure for the rest of their time that they did stock the shelves, reflecting the growing diversity of our city. Over the years, as David and I have mapped out our sermon outlines for the months that follow, one of the issues that we keep coming back to is, why are we still racist? Why is racism still a part of America? How does it persist? We had the genocide of Native Americans in the 17th and 18th centuries. We had 300 years of African slavery. We had a miserable start to the 20th century with Jim Crow laws, redlining, school segregation. But then we went through years of the very public work of the civil rights movement. How is it in 2021 we're still writing sermons about racism? Where does it come from? And how do we get rid of it? How do we get to a point where we recognize that all lives matter, including Black lives and Native Americans and Latinos and Latinas and Asians, that we're all a part of what makes America, America? I love the song from the Broadway musical South Pacific that so artfully states that you've got to be carefully taught racism. Sean has sung it for us in church many times. You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made and people whose skin's a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. I love the song. However, I must beg to differ. Because in truth, racism is taught just by absorbing it from the culture. We're programmed unconsciously by what we see on TV, who we see on billboards, the models we see in magazines. It becomes the unconscious assumption of everyone who reads the news that the people who are in the news are the important people, that they are the ones who really matter. They matter because we see them in the news, we see them in movies, we see them in TV shows, we see them on stage. Admittedly, we do still have people among us who are actively teaching racism. You can see them in the news a lot of days when they are at somebody's school board meeting protesting the teaching of critical race theory, by which they mean any history lesson that includes an accurate bit of description about the American genocide of indigenous tribes or the abuses of African slaves or the inscription of captured Chinese labor. But it doesn't take an Archie Bunker type spewing racial prejudice on a daily basis to pass racism on to the next generation. Racism is like a self-perpetuating machine that just keeps cranking out new generations of racists until we make the conscious decision to start balancing our unconscious programming in news, advertisements, and TV sitcom characters. As hard as people like me work to break down the prejudices that most church people had towards gays and lesbians, I know that it was the characters on sitcoms and talk show hosts who were openly gay that really did the groundbreaking work of changing the way that people thought about gay people. Just as the same sorts of shows began to change the way that white people thought about black people, and for that matter, Jews, through drama and comedy. But that was a deliberate choice. Networks decided to take a chance on using their platform to aid the public in opening their eyes to issues of race and sexual orientation, often using laughter to dispel hatred. Now, for the last 35 years, I've delivered some pretty hard-hitting sermons, and I like to think that I've been a part of challenging those prejudices. But if I were asked honestly which is the most effective, the comedy sitcoms with a lovable gay character, or me literally threatening to pull people's arms off if they don't stop being prejudiced, I think the sitcoms may work better. Having openly gay sitcom characters and talk show hosts, it wasn't the only thing that actually brought about social change, but it was a part of it. It was an important part of it. Just like now, asking the news media to treat people of color as being as important as white people will be part of changing how young people of color see themselves and how they value themselves. And honestly, guys, it isn't just about race. You never hear the media getting all pumped up about a missing person who's not attractive. You don't ever hear them cry about a missing fat person or an old person or a poor person. It's the beautiful, young, white, blonde, blue-eyed girls that we always hear about. And obviously they can't cover everyone equally because there's 10,000 missing people a month. But they can diversify their coverage to help pull the racism out of our culture by the roots so that we don't keep raising one generation of racists after another. So I implore you to be patient when people of color or people in marginalized groups are pushing back against the majority culture. It doesn't always feel good. I kept up the demanding pace of writing a newspaper article every week for years, which, along with writing sermons and teaching classes, doesn't really give you a lot of time for extra research and editing. And I remember having written a piece advocating for the rights of the trans community, but in my essay, this was a decade ago, I used the word transgendered. and a very angry trans person called me to let me know how uninformed and misguided I was. He explained that becoming trans is never in a past tense event. We are all in the process of change and of becoming. So when you say transgendered, you make it sound like it was a singular event that happened one day in 1989 in August or something. And so I'm certain that my response to this caller was not nearly as diplomatic as it should have been. Because language does matter. Changing words, images, characters in a play, the faces on the news, that's what changes how we think. Though I think it's all too easy for liberals to attack their sympathizers and supporters, the truth is that critic on the phone was teaching me. I didn't want to be taught at that moment. I wasn't in a mood to hear it. And yet the discomfort of it is what taught me. And I have never used that word again. It's true enough that none of us ever change unless someone makes us uncomfortable. When we are happy with the status quo, we don't do much soul searching, and we don't expend the energy to grow and change. When we are being asked to be aware of police killings of unarmed black men, when we are told of hundreds of missing Indigenous women, or even when we are being asked to change the name of a sports team that either glorifies the Crusades or exploits Indigenous tribes, if being asked to make that change makes us uncomfortable, then we should slow down and ask ourselves if we are uncomfortable because someone is discovering which rock our racism is hidden under. Being uncomfortable may mean that you are being presented with an opportunity in which to learn, to grow, to become more of that better person you keep telling yourself you are. I am suggesting that we all let go of our defensiveness about a too comfortable status quo and to try to consciously welcome the challenges hidden in our progress towards a time when maybe racism really will be a part of our past. We're not there yet, so defending the status quo is clearly not a good idea. We can envision a world without racism, and that is the world where we want to live, right? So don't grow tired of thinking new thoughts and letting go of old prejudices and the privilege that defends it. We are literally tearing ourselves free of the prejudices that defined our past in order to live in a newly free way. And if we can live that way, then everyone can be free.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.